The little baby dogs, they did look very cute.
Yeah. So all the best, let's hope. But back to the issues of showering.
I was going to say, can we not end the show on the missing dogs, please?
Because they have this roll through. Showering less often doesn't need to mean bad smells. I stopped using soap in the shower about 5 years ago, Susan. Instead, daily I use a flannel and handmade liquid using a dried South American berry. I haven't needed to use deodorant since. So...
It's a matter of interpretation,
Yep.
but I'm concerned about how this is all very directed at myself.
No, it's a team effort.
Here we go. Look, more than a decade before, in 1972, the requirement for a prescription in order to obtain polyunsaturated margarine was removed by an amendment to the Margarine Act 1908. There you go.
We've discovered it. Kua muriti hōtaka mō tēnei rā kia pai tō koutou pō. The program's finished for this afternoon. I'm back with you tomorrow. See you then.
Whakarongo mai koe ki te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. E haere aki nei, more details emerge of heroic actions during the countdown stabbings. An off-duty police officer helped subdue the alleged attacker, and a corrections staffer is among the wounded. A 42-year-old man appears in court charged with 4 counts of attempted murder. It's the kind of ruck and maul rugby can do without. Allegations of drunken disorder, racism and assault at a Wellington club game are under investigation. The Auditor General gives the $14 billion government wage subsidy a thorough going over. Turns out MSD was a little slacker with its audits. And have you seen Scruff and Floss, the full-scale land and air search for 2 much-loved dogs that are MIA?
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora, ko Susana Leata with DNA. Police are warning that the 4 people injured in the supermarket stabbing in Dunedin yesterday have a long road to recovery. A 42-year-old man has appeared in the District Court in Dunedin this afternoon, facing 4 charges of attempted murder in relation to the knife attack at the city's Countdown store on Cumberland Street. He has name suppression and will reappear in court next month. The Southern District Commander, Superintendent Paul Basham, is also thanking those who came to the aid of the injured.
I would like in particular to recognise the Countdown staff who first intervened and were the initial victims. I'd also like to acknowledge the members of the public that came to their assistance, restraining the alleged offender and in providing aid and comfort to the injured.
Meanwhile, Southern DHB Emergency Department Clinical Director Dr Rich Stevenson says hospital staff have also worked hard.
Received several critically unwell patients into the emergency department at very short notice, and I am proud of the job our hospital team did in caring for them. 3 people remain in a serious condition, but we are pleased to say that they are stable. All 4 have required surgery, and we wish them all the best and a speedy recovery.
The 4 victims of the attack remain in hospital. 1 person is in a moderate condition and 3 others are in a serious but stable condition. The Council of Trade Unions says things are back on track after crisis talks at the Beehive over the government's public sector pay freeze. Unions were incensed by the 3-year pay guidance under which those paid more than $60,000 could get a pay rise only in exceptional circumstances and those over $100,000 not at all. Here's our political editor, Jane Patterson.
After meetings today, the CTU says there is agreement around good faith bargaining, scope to discuss cost of living increases and negotiations for all members covered by collectives and a review next year. The anger of members was relayed, but the union says things are now back on track. The government says its expectations from last week have not changed and insists it's not a pay freeze. From Parliament, Jane Patterson.
The Auditor General isn't convinced the Ministry for Social Development is doing enough to recover cash from businesses which wrongly received wage subsidies. More than $13 billion has been paid out through the wage subsidy scheme during the COVID-19 pandemic, and the Auditor General's office launched an inquiry last year into how it was being managed. Its findings show that MSD audits of payments consisted mainly of verbal confirmation and lacked documentation. Minister Carmel Sepuloni says the advice has been taken on board.
Yeah, it was a high trust model. We had to be really pragmatic and we had to roll it out with speed. And so, there's some points that are made in the report that we should take away and that we should look at. And moving forward, if we're in a position where we have to have a wage subsidy again, then we should be constantly looking for ways to improve.
The Auditor General is recommending MSD tests a sample of audits against evidence from applicants. A man who acted as a scout in the killing of Ricky Wang has been told he acted with callousness and indignity by concealing the death for 2 years. 24-year-old Yu Gaoshang has been sentenced to 19 months in prison in the High Court in Auckland, charged with being an accessory after the fact. Katie Todd reports.
Following Mr Wang's death in 2017, Yu Gaoshang mopped up at the scene with bleach, cleaned Mr Wang's apartment and helped bury the body in the central North Island. He drove a vehicle to the burial site looking out for any police officers. He then kept his silence for 2 years. Yu was acting on the demands of a drug ring. He is already in prison on drugs charges and he will serve a 19-month prison term in addition to that sentence. Ko Katie Todd, TNA.
It's 5 minutes past 5. The Black Caps cricketer Tim Seifert is on the improve after contracting COVID-19 in India. The wicket-keeper batsman has been unable to return home from the abandoned IPL competition with other New Zealand-based cricketers. Black Caps coach Gary Stead has been exchanging messages with Seifert and says he's feeling more upbeat.
Obviously it was distressing pretty early on to get that news, but I think he's in a much better space now that there's a plan around him, and I guess now we just wait for the negative test to come through and for that to hopefully get out of his system.
The Test side leaves for England this weekend for 2 tests against England and the Test Championship final against India. All Whites footballer Chris Wood has played a leading hand in keeping Burnley in the English Premier League. Wood scored in Burnley's 2-0 win over Fulham, moving them up to 14th on the table and out of relegation trouble. But the results confirms Fulham's demise after just 1 season back in the Premiership. Japan's Ki Nishikori has expressed concern at staging the Tokyo Olympics as the country battles a surge in COVID-19 cases. He's echoed comments from compatriot and women's world number 1 Naomi Osaka, saying the risks of holding the Games amid the pandemic should continue to be carefully discussed, with Tokyo under a state of emergency 10 weeks out from the event.
If you think only about athlete, I think you can do it. If you can make good bubble and maybe you can do it, but there's some risk too. What's happened if there's 100 cases in a village or can be thousands.
And that's the news.
Horror in a Dunedin supermarket.
Then we saw this woman, she was walking, blood, full of blood on her face.
A feeling of security evaporates.
The most chilling thing about it could have been any of us or any of our families that were in there.
And warnings of mounting abuse faced by retail workers.
I don't think I've ever felt so stressed about anything in my life in terms of what my team has to put up with every day.
Sounding the alarm. Morning Report, weekdays from 6 on air and online.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland to Waitomo, Coromandel Peninsula, Bay of Plenty and Taupo. A few showers turning to rain for a time tonight and tomorrow with possible thunderstorms. Gisborne and Hawke's Bay showers developing tonight, turning to rain tomorrow afternoon. Taranaki to Wellington, also Taumaranui, Taihape and Wairarapa. Scattered rain becoming widespread, possibly heavy tonight with a strong, cold southeasterly change. Rain easing tomorrow morning but becoming widespread again tomorrow night. For Marlborough, Nelson and Buller, periods of rain, possibly thundery for Buller tonight, easing around midnight, clearing tomorrow evening. Canterbury, Otago and Southland, rain becoming widespread, snow lowering to 600 metres, clearing to fine tomorrow morning. Westland and Fiordland rain, heavy and possibly thundery, clearing to fine weather overnight. And Chatham Islands, low cloud and drizzle, turning to rain tomorrow morning. RNZ National, it's 7 minutes past 5.
Thanks, Susanna. Tēnā koutou katoa, no mai haere mai ki Checkpoint e tēnei rā. Ko Lisa Owen tēnei. It's been revealed an off-duty police officer who just happened to be shopping at a Dunedin countdown played a critical role in subduing the man accused of seriously stabbing 4 people in a violent daytime attack. A second officer who was in store at the time stepped in to help too. The 4 injured people are still in hospital and are said to have a long road to recovery. A 42-year-old man accused of 4 counts of attempted murder appeared in Dunedin District Court today as more details of the swift actions of bystanders and staff emerged, among them a Corrections Department worker. Our reporter Louise Tanuth and cameraman Nathan McKinnon have the latest.
The bravery of those who jumped into action, praised by police today.
They were a part of a group of human beings that intervened to support other people that were being attacked.
Southern District Commander Superintendent Paul Basham says they included countdown staff, members of the public and 2 police officers, one who was off duty.
The actions of those 2 officers and indeed all of the people involved, the countdown staff and members of the public, helped to de-escalate the situation and minimise any further harm. Our first responders were on the scene very quickly, and I've received feedback that indicates they provided a high standard of first aid that almost certainly saved the lives of some of the victims.
2 staff members and a corrections officer are among the 4 who sustained injuries in the attack.
I think it's fair to say that they're all significant and will have some ongoing consequences.
That's Dr Richard Stevenson, who was the medical lead at Dunedin Hospital yesterday afternoon. He says all 4 victims needed surgery and staff quickly rallied to provide the necessary care to them all.
We were able to mobilise multiple trauma teams to look after each patient individually, and we were able to open several acute operating theatres to deal with the requirement for emergency operations as well.
It's as a witness describes the attack as relentless. Jenny McDowell was browsing the toiletries aisle at about 2:30 yesterday afternoon when she heard a commotion.
I just heard sort of a screaming and a lot of shouting, and I looked up and saw a countdown employee being attacked.
She says the attacker was armed with what she believes was a paring knife.
The lady had blood all over the side of her face. The guy was just on top of her. He was not relenting, and the lady was trying to shield her face.
She says people quickly leapt into action.
In turn, the guy turned on them and started stabbing at them. He was just relentless.
She describes the 3 or 4 people who stepped in as heroes.
They just tried to pin him down. One guy had a chair on him, just putting his full weight on it, just trying to pin him down, because I don't think he would have stopped.
Others tried to distract the attacker from afar.
People were trying to throw, I think they were bottles, but I couldn't quite be sure, just to try and distract him, to try and subdue the man, really.
Meanwhile, she and others tried to care for the victims, who were still conscious.
The man who sustained the neck injury just kept saying, my wife, is my wife okay? I was just trying to comfort him and also apply pressure with a countdown staff member who'd removed his jersey to apply pressure to the wound. He acted very quickly and bravely.
Jenny isn't sure how long the attack lasted, but thinks it was about 5 to 10 minutes before he was restrained. She's certain the actions of bystanders stopped the attack from being much worse. It says the community struggles to come to terms with the violence that took place.
I do know someone who works there. It would be terrible. I mean, having to deal with that and then having to administer first aid to your fellow workers, I mean, pretty hard.
I was just very shocked, honestly, just because it was so close, and my mother was there like an hour before it happened, so she was quite freaked out by it. I know we're all just disgusted, especially if someone would just do something like that.
No, I mean, sure, there'll be people that are scared and watching their backs, but I think we bounce back pretty quick with these things. People rally together, I think, really, don't they?
For now, the supermarket's doors remain closed as they figure out how to move forward. In Dunedin, for Checkpoint, Louise Tanuth.
And the 42-year-old was granted interim name suppression, has been remanded in custody until June 1st when he will appear in court again. It is almost 13 minutes past 5 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. And still to come on the programme, MSD is encouraged to crack down on businesses that got the wage subsidy when they shouldn't have. Public sector unions are claiming a government backed down on its promised pay freeze after a massive backlash. Both sides were locked in crisis talks today, emerging this afternoon with some sort of consensus. Here's our Deputy Political Editor, Craig McCulloch.
This is what damage control looks like. Labour and the unions playing kiss and make up.
I would describe the meeting as constructive.
We had a really constructive conversation.
Well, it was a good conversation. It was a constructive meeting.
It's a far cry from the fury on display over the past week. The unions in uproar over the announced 2-year public sector pay freeze. Ministers were crystal clear last Wednesday. No increases for those earning more than $60,000, except in exceptional circumstances. No increases at all for those on more than $100,000. But a week on, that position's thawing.
The government remains committed to good faith bargaining, and in good faith bargaining, of course, there's room for compromise.
The unions went into crisis talks with the government today, the Public Service Association with the Prime Minister, in a pre-arranged sit-down this morning. Other unions met with the Public Service Minister, Chris Hipkins, at noon.
We talked about some of the misunderstanding that was out there. I think we were able to clarify that.
We should have put more emphasis on the things that haven't necessarily been out there in the public domain. The fact that people will still move through their pay scales, that those existing agreements remain and there will be negotiation.
The government is keen to stress that those with step-based progression, for example, nurses, teachers and police officers, will still move up their pay scale every year. But that was never in question. It also ignores the many other public sector staff who don't have such arrangements. An agreement today to look to address that.
We'll work with the PSA and other unions on that because there is a gap for some workers.
And that is not the only concession. The Council of Trade Unions President Richard Wagstaff says the government has agreed that negotiations will not be predetermined, which means all workers could see pay bumps in line with inflation.
There's certainly scope to discuss the cost of living increases in negotiations for all union members covered by collectives, regardless of salary. We also agreed, by the way, that we'll review this guidance next year, so we don't have to wait 3 years to look at it again.
We have agreed that we'll look at that again at the end of next year.
Labour denies any back down, but it is clear its message to the unions has very much softened. For now, that long-held relationship is mended. But whether it stays that way will now depend on what happens at the negotiating table. Atu iti whare parimata mō te hōtaka o te ahiahi, ko Craig McCulloch ahu.
There's allegations sideline boozing at a Wellington club rugby game led to racial slurs and a brawl in the final minutes of a match, with one spectator knocked to the ground. Wellington Rugby is investigating the incident at the game between the Marist St Pat's and Old Boys University clubs at Wellington College on Saturday. Parts of the altercation were caught on match video, but apparently not the racial abuse. And now there's allegation and counter-allegation from the opposing teams. Marist St Pat's chairman, Rob Evans, was at the game. He says the Old Boys kicked the final try, but some of their supporters who had been drinking rushed onto the field before the full-time whistle and yelled vile racial slurs. He describes the lead-up to the confrontation.
I was probably 30 metres away. I didn't hear or see too much other than, I guess, just normal sort of boisterous behaviour if you're intoxicated at a game of rugby. They were cheering on their side. And so that was what I saw during the game. It wasn't until after the events that occurred after the try when they came on, I went over to try and help support and break things up.
What made you think they were drunk?
They had cans of beer and were drinking.
For how long had you seen them drinking?
Oh, throughout the game, and I have a lot of witnesses. I've now seen witness statements who have said the same.
So then, what has led to the physical argy-bargy?
Well, there's no camera at this time. There's no visual of that. But as I understand it, allegedly a supporter of Marist St Pat's, an elderly man, was pushed over. after a confrontation with some of the supporters, and I understand a lot of racial abuse was said at the same time, and that then caused the actions of the players to take part in trying to resolve that.
Okay, there's a lot in that. So when you say there's alleged racial abuse, from who, directed at who?
From the group of supporters directed at the Marist Pets players and some of the supporters, I understand, as well.
And do you know what was said?
I have statements, but I will withhold those for the moment because we have a process to work through. So I've got a number of statements in the order of about 30 statements from supporters who were there.
Did someone use the N word?
Yes, there's a number of profanities and racial profanities used, which I'd rather not say now, but I think those have...
But that is one of them, Rob, as you understand it.
Allegedly, one of the words was used is that I've seen that in some of the submissions.
So, after the alleged racial slurs, was there then a physical confrontation from both sides, where players from both sides got involved?
No, the players from OVU were not involved, as far as I can see. The game itself was played in a great spirit, and the game would have ended quite happily at that point. For one side, I guess, who won the game and had the supporters not come on the field. But one of the parents of the players was pushed over. One of the parents of the Marist and Pats players was pushed over, and that led to some of the players from Marist and Pats reacting.
When you say reacting, what do you mean, Rob?
They approached the supporters, and there was a confrontation. I have not seen any evidence of punching as yet. There's been no evidence of any punching that occurred, but there was some players, approached the supporters to try and get them away from the gentleman who was pushed over.
So, how would you describe the behaviour that you saw?
I'd describe it as quite disgusting, to be honest, and it's a blight on our game and our community that we continually have these racist taunts and abuse. And I know, talking to our players, the Marist players, that they're disappointed the way we reacted after the game, but they were incensed by what was being said, and they were also incensed with one of their whānau being pushed over.
And people will probably appreciate that. But why is it that seemingly, as you say, there's been incidents before, it seems to be an increasingly frequent problem, these kinds of clashes?
You're talking about racial clashes or...?
Just sideline, argy-bargy, bad behaviour, bad language.
Case, I don't know. In this case, there's a couple of things at play. There's poor field management. There was no ropes to keep supporters back. Alcohol was not permitted on school grounds, and we were on a school ground. So there's a number of things that need to be looked at in terms of this whole process of how it led to what happened. I mean, as I said, the game would have ended quite satisfactorily. The two teams played a great game, and there was absolutely no need for any of this to occur. So there's some things that led up to what did occur, which we're all disappointed with. But I simply cannot tolerate this ongoing racial abuse and the language that was used against our community.
Should the players from Marist St Pat's reacted in the way they did?
Well, probably not. I mean, they were first to admit that they, didn't want to or shouldn't have reacted like that. I guess you'd have to, it's a pretty test of character if that was you receiving that abuse, of how you might react. So Rob, we appreciate that's not the reaction, but it's very difficult in the heat of the moment when you see and hear what went on.
What do you think of the sideline boozing?
Well, there's no place for it in club rugby. It's illegal. I'm not sure about other games, but certainly in club rugby in Wellington, and it's not permitted, and certainly in school grounds it's not permitted.
So whose job was it to go tap these guys on the shoulder and say, hey, you can't be drinking here?
Well, it's the host team's responsibility.
It was the old boys were hosting, so it was their responsibility to go and say to these guys, don't be drinking.
Correct, yes.
And it was their supporters.
Yes.
So is this on them then?
Well, I mean, certainly from a certain part of the community's perspective, the racial abuse is on them, and we'll have to see how the rugby union handle, our reaction to that. But firstly and foremostly, we need to deal with the issue of racism.
So racism is the issue here?
Oh, absolutely. It's at the core of the issue. We're bitterly disappointed. Continued marginalisation of people by race or whatever, or religion or gender is just intolerable, and we need to deal with this matter at the highest level and very sensitively, and it's an important factor if we want to move forward.
Marist St Pat's chairman Rob Evans there. The Old Boys University would not be interviewed, but in a statement it points out the allegations of racism are against a spectator, not a player. The club says the alleged behaviour does not reflect its values, and OBU does not condone or tolerate any conduct of this nature. It also claims the alleged racist comments follow on from an assault on a spectator and verbal abuse of match officials, allegedly by Marist St Pat's players. For its part, Wellington Rugby says misconduct complaints have been laid against both teams, and there's a hearing on Thursday. It notes there is zero tolerance for alcohol consumption on the sidelines of Wellington Club rugby matches. Homai o Whakaaro, love to hear your thoughts on this one. Is sideline drinking a problem at rugby games? What happens at your local club? And do clubs need to crack down on behaviour on the sidelines? You can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. The government has unveiled its plan to tackle rising gun violence among gangs by banning high-risk people from having firearms. Any gang members who appear before the courts will come under the firearms prohibition orders. The new tool will be at the disposal of judges who will slap the restrictions on any person found to have participated in organised crime. Ben Strang has more.
According to police figures, gang numbers are booming. The arrival of 501s from Australia has added an increasingly dangerous element to the organised crime culture in New Zealand, leaving the already entrenched gangs on high alert. That means guns are flooding the streets, and not only do gang members feel they need to use them, but they're more willing to. The Police Minister, Portal Williams, says the introduction of firearms prohibition orders will crack down on the arming up of gangs and lead to safer communities around the country.
Gun crime is of increasing concern to our communities, to police and to the government. This government is committed to stopping violence and the impact of violent gun crime in our communities.
The government's announcement comes after relentless pressure from the opposition over its treatment of gang and gun issues. For the past few years, the National Party has pushed for FPOs to be introduced, and its police spokesperson, Simeon Brown, has a bill before the House on that. It now won't proceed, with the government saying it put forward a better plan which will catch more people.
They go much wider than the Members' Bill does. They capture people not just who associate in organised crime groups, but people who commit serious offences under Section 86A, I think it is, of the Sentencing Act, people who qualify under the Terrorism Act. So it's a much broader group of people that will be captured, but the most serious of offenders.
Portal Williams says she expects 1,000 people to be slapped with a firearms prohibition order each year under the government's plan, compared to 600 a year under National's proposed legislation. But National's plan didn't leave things in the hands of future crime and would have been more proactive. Party leader Judith Collins says, while the government's making a step in the right direction, their plan lacks teeth.
They're not allowing what we've proposed, which is for the police commissioner to essentially issue the firearm prohibition orders, and instead we have to wait for someone who is a violent offender to go and shoot someone, essentially, before they get a firearm prohibition order. It seems somewhat like shutting the gate after the balls got out.
National Party police spokesperson Simeon Brown agrees.
I'm pleased that the government is acknowledging that issue today around firearm prohibition orders, but the legislation they're proposing is toothless. It doesn't give the police the tools they actually need to take a real handle in cracking down on firearm violence that the gangs are causing in New Zealand.
Portal Williams says the government hasn't had any advice on what impact firearms prohibition orders could have on Māori. She says it's all about dealing with the most serious offenders. The minister did, however, acknowledge there have been issues with systemic racism within the police.
It is my absolute desire to ensure that we don't continue to have disproportionate rates of arrest and conviction for Māori. Police are doing a lot of work in that space, currently looking at who it is that they speak to and who it is that they charge, their charging decisions, and I totally support that. I think that's part of a wider piece of work that we need to do as part of the justice sector.
The government also announced changes to the Criminal Proceeds Act, giving new powers to the police to restrain the assets of gangs and criminal enterprises. Gangs will have to prove that a property was obtained by legitimate means, and if they can't prove that, it can be seized and sold. Justice Minister Chris Farfoy says the law change is expected to net about $25 million a year for the Proceeds of Crime Fund and put a serious dent in the activities of gangs. For Checkpoint, Ben Strang.
The owner of an American laboratory that tested sunscreen products sold in New Zealand has pleaded guilty to falsifying results. Several brands available here relied on results from the company to support their SPF claims. Cosmetics New Zealand says it hopes a sunscreen bill will become law to better regulate the industry. Chen Yu reports.
The owner of New York-based AMA Laboratories, Gabriel Letizia Jr., admitted defrauding customers and causing sunscreens to be marketed on the basis of false reports. The 71-year-old will be sentenced in September. Consumer New Zealand Chief Executive John Duffy says for many years, manufacturers used these reports to justify their sun protection claims when Consumer New Zealand found their sunscreens weren't up to standard. Mr. Duffy says sunscreen testing is expensive and AMA was perhaps trying to save money.
What AMA Labs were doing and what the owner has now pleaded guilty to doing is using far fewer humans in the testing process than was required, which meant that the test results couldn't be averaged out as accurately as they should be.
He says in Consumer New Zealand's latest test, several brands relied on results from AMA, including EcoSol Water Shield Sunscreen, Natural Instinct Invisible Natural Sunscreen, and Sukan Sun Care Sheer Touch Facial Sunscreen. Mr. Duffy says his organisation works with the Ministry of Health to test sunscreens every year, but due to the high cost, not every product is being tested. But people can refer to their website for reliable products.
We use labs that are not AMA. And often we'll use two labs and cross-reference the results before we publish. So yes, there are sunscreens on the market that pass, and that information is available for free on consumer.org.nz, so consumers can look it up there.
Executive Director at Cosmetics New Zealand, Garth Wiley, says it has been a few years since charges against the AMA were first lodged. He says since then, his organisation has been recommending member companies to avoid using that lab.
From an industry perspective, we are fairly comfortable that most companies and manufacturers have moved away from using this company purely for the reputational issue.
Mr. Wiley says in New Zealand, under the Fair Trading Act, companies need to prove their SPF claims are correct. And under the cosmetics standards administered by the Environment Protection Authority, all cosmetics must be safe and fit for purpose. Still, he hopes the sunscreen bill, which is at select committee stage, will become law.
We have a private members bill in the Parliament which will mandate the New Zealand-Australian joint standard. and the test methodologies that are set out within that are the international standard tests. And that is actually the methodology that, as an industry, we believe should be followed.
According to the attorney for the Southern District of New York, Letizia and senior staff at the U.S. company defrauded customers of more than $63 million over 30 years until 2017. He's facing up to 7 years in prison. Consumer New Zealand is urging manufacturers rely on reports from the company to urgently retest their products. 冇就好特卡我只阿下顯內過陳了天內。
Kia ora e te iwi e Hariaki nei checkpoint. We'll have the latest on the Dunedin stabbings after 6. The so-called scout and clean-up guy in the alleged Desert Road murder is jailed. And the full-scale air and land search for 2 much-loved canines. Have you seen Scruff and Floss? Homai or Whakaaro, we would love to hear from you about anything you've heard on the program tonight. You can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. It is time now for the headlines with Susanna.
Police in Dunedin are seeking further witnesses as they build a picture of the chaotic events at yesterday's Countdown supermarket stabbings. All 4 people injured at the Cumberland Street supermarket remain in hospital. 1 is in a moderate condition and 3 others are in a serious but stable condition. A 42-year-old appeared in the Dunedin District Court this afternoon, charged with 4 counts of attempted murder and has been granted interim name suppression. Unions are claiming progress in the dispute over the government's pay freeze after crisis talks at the Beehive today. Ministers have been meeting with public sector unions amid warnings of serious disruption and industrial action unless there was movement. CTU President Richard Wagstaff says there was agreement on the need for good faith bargaining with no preset outcomes. The government is making it illegal for what it calls high-risk people to own firearms in a bid to crack down on gangs. It will introduce firearms prohibition orders, preventing certain people from having or being around guns. The Police Minister, Poto Williams, says offences that will lead to a firearms prohibition order include participating in an organised crime group or gang, serious violence, serious gun offences and terrorism. A man has been sentenced to 19 months in prison for helping bury a man's body in the central North Island. Yu Gaoshang helped transport the remains of Bao Zhang or Ricky Wang to Desert Road, then clean the scene and Mr Wang's Central City apartment. The 24-year-old was sentenced in the High Court in Auckland this morning. Yu Gaoshang is already in prison for drug crimes. The US television network NBC says it will not broadcast the Golden Globe ceremony next year, joining a growing wave of criticism about the organisers' behaviour and lack of diversity. Those are the latest news headlines on RNZ National. Our next news and weather update is at 6.
Kia ora rā, Susanna. And no mai hoki mai, this is Checkpoint, ko Lisa Owen tēnei, and it is time now for the business news. Nona Peltier's joined me in the studio. Nona, we've heard a lot about homeowners and their mortgages, and so we know that some of them are struggling to pay their mortgages, but the situation is not as bad as was anticipated?
Yeah, so this data that's collected from Centrix, which is a credit reporting agency, has found that there are, 10% increase in the number of mortgages that are in arrears. That's 11,900 mortgages. But that's far fewer than they were expecting because of the strain with COVID, a number of people finding it difficult to make ends meet and, of course, not making an income and so forth. But because of the way that the banks have managed their relationships with their borrowers and, the support that people have received from the government, things are a whole lot better than everyone was expecting. And it seems very unlikely now that we're going to have the large number of mortgagee sales that we were expecting to see. And even if that happens, people are likely to be able to find someone to buy their house no trouble because homes are still in very high demand. So overall, it's a better position than we were expecting, and that's reflected, of course, in some of the reports we had recently from the banks, where they had written back, provisions for bad debts and so on. Things are a lot better, and not only that, but there's greater demand now for loans. Like that's almost 95% of where we were pre-COVID in terms of people wanting to borrow money for cars and so forth. So it's almost business as usual, I guess.
Yeah, for some people.
For some people.
So the number that they said to you there that are in arrears, did they provide a forecast number? Do we know how much better it is than what they anticipated?
No,
sorry to put
we
you on the
don't.
spot.
Well, we don't know that. Not from the report that we got. But there was a big anticipation. Certainly, the banks had set aside a lot of money for that kind of thing, and it just hasn't materialized. And the numbers that we're seeing now suggest that it probably won't. So, whether or not 10% is an industry standard, I don't know.
Right.
But it doesn't. It's certainly what the company is saying is that it's a lot better than they were expecting. Yeah.
Okay. Let's move on to private investors who are looking for opportunities, somewhere to put their money. And some of them want science and tech opportunities, but they can't find them. Why?
Well, that's a really interesting one. So we had a problem for a long time where startup companies and science and technology were really struggling to find that even early stage investment. We solved that problem, but then there was the growth phase that people were having a hard time. So the government came up with this $300 million to support growth funding and that kind of thing. But in the end, what's really happened is that there aren't that many companies to invest in to begin with. And part of the reason is that the universities are not, according to the private investors who got together last week and had a meeting to discuss all these issues, they sort of decided that really the universities are not helping develop a pipeline of, PhD students who are coming out with really good ideas for potential development in science and technology. So that pipeline from academic through to commercialization is just not there. And so I said, well, what's the answer? Yeah. And he said, there's no silver bullet. That's what we always hear when there's no answer.
Maybe we need a science and tech student to come up with one.
Yeah, perhaps that would be a good one, right?
So you bring market numbers for us as well.
Yeah, so yesterday we talked about how the market took a hammering because of the dairy sector. And now it's Asia's turn. So that things turned last week. Yesterday we talked about Asia and Australia at record highs because people were feeling that inflation was under control. Today it's all reversed. Like, everybody's now worried about inflation going sky high because commodity prices have gone sky high. But because we had our bad day yesterday, today wasn't so bad. In fact, we only fell slightly, 20 points. It's hardly anything, to 12,639. So we're almost where we were yesterday. And the New Zealand dollar is steady at 72.6 US cents and 92.8 Australian and 51.4 British pence.
Thanks, Nona. That's Nona Peltier with Business. The Auditor General wants the Ministry for Social Development to crack down on businesses that got the wage subsidy and didn't need it. The multi-billion-dollar wage subsidy scheme was designed to keep as many people as possible in their jobs during last year's lockdowns. While the Auditor General's office has praised some efforts to avoid businesses taking money when they shouldn't, he says MSD's so-called audits of those who received payments need to go further. Nita Blake-Person reports.
The government spent more on the wage subsidy scheme than any other part of its COVID-19 response. And the bill is huge. Around $13.3 billion flew out the door to keep people in their jobs. 70,000 applications in one day alone. $1.8 billion paid out in one 24-hour period. Social Development Minister Carmel Sepuloni says they were acting quickly to keep people in work.
It was a high trust model. We had to be really pragmatic and we had to roll it out with speed.
And for the most part, that has worked. Unemployment has remained much lower than the daunting forecasts of last year's lockdowns. But with the wage subsidies high trust comes a high risk of fraud, and that's what's worrying the Auditor General's office. A spokesman, David Press, says while steps were taken to ensure businesses were eligible, the checks that have been done afterwards were cursory.
So MSD has done in the order of around 7,000 of these reviews, and the reviews largely have relied on talking with people about their situation, asking them whether they are eligible for the scheme and whether they've complied with the obligations that go with receiving the money in the scheme. And the issue that we've raised is that those checks have been largely verbal. They haven't involved actual documents that provide provide proof.
There have been no prosecutions so far linked to the scheme. The Ministry for Social Development also deals with welfare clients, and inequality researcher Max Rashbrook says there's a stark difference in treatment.
If MSD thinks you might be a benefit fraudster, they pursue you to the ends of the earth. And with this scheme, MSD just rang people up and said, did you do everything correctly? And if people did, then that was it. And they had the cheek to call that an audit.
The Auditor General's office is careful not to call those ring-arounds audits in its report. It says they are more reviews. MSD has today started referring to them as pre- and post-payment integrity checks. David Press says the Auditor General is recommending MSD tests a sample of those reviews against evidence from applicants to see how they check out and how much money might need to be repaid.
Extra work looking at the reviews should give some sort of sense of the extent to which there has been abuse, if any, of the scheme, and then that would help enable a monetary value to be placed on that, or a more likely a monetary value than we have now. Having said that, there's hundreds of millions of dollars have been paid back already.
They're also recommending MSD seek written confirmation from all applicants about their compliance. Tax researcher Dr Michael Goumet has been an outspoken critic of companies which took the wage subsidy but later posted profits. He says there could have been checks at the beginning too.
There's no requirement to demonstrate your financial ability to actually sustain yourself for a period. Now, some of these organisations we know are financially well off, and one of the other criteria that came through in setting up the scheme was for businesses to demonstrate that. But as I say, there's no criteria. There would have been simple ways to do that.
Carmel Cipollone says the government is listening.
We're going to take on their advice and then go away and then do what we can to increase the level of integrity checks that we've been asked for, and so we can do that.
MSD has referred just over 1,000 wage subsidy cases for investigation. 477 have been resolved, 371 are underway, and the rest are waiting to be assigned an investigator. A number of cases are under consideration for civil proceedings or criminal prosecutions, but MSD says no decisions have been made as of yet. For Checkpoint, Nita Blakeperson.
There's growing concern about the global consequences of India's latest COVID-19 outbreak, and its Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, is facing growing pressure to impose a nationwide lockdown. Top US health advisor Anthony Fauci has joined those calls, saying it's the only way India can break the trend of record infection numbers. The ABC's Gavin Coote reports.
The images of burning funeral pyres and overloaded crematoriums have become the tragic emblems of India's second COVID wave. About 4,000 people are dying of the virus in India each day, and many experts fear the actual numbers are far greater. Kumar is among the crematorium workers in the southern Indian city of Bangalore.
I cremate about 50 bodies of COVID-19 victims in a day. I come here at 7 in the morning and I stay here until 10 o'clock at night.
As many of India's crematoriums run out of space, makeshift facilities are becoming increasingly common. But on the banks of the Ganges River in the country's north, things have taken yet another grim turn. The bodies of at least 40 people have washed up along the river, which local media reports suggest could be COVID-19 victims. India's situation is dire, and it's one that the World Health Organization is warning poses a global health risk. The WHO has now designated the COVID-19 variant first found in India one of global concern. Its technical lead for COVID-19 is Maria Van Kerkhove.
In consultation with our virus evolution working group and our EPI teams and our lab teams internally, there is some available information to suggest increased transmissibility of B.1.617.
By declaring it a variant of concern, the WHO is acknowledging growing evidence which finds the mutation of the virus in India could be spread more quickly than the original strain. It's only classified 3 others to be of global concern, those found in Britain, South Africa and Brazil. As India's coronavirus infections hover around daily record highs, calls have been growing for a nationwide lockdown, including from leading figures outside of India. The US's top COVID advisor, Anthony Fauci, says he's advised Indian authorities that it's the only way to arrest the surge in cases. telling the American ABC network the current lockdowns affecting some cities and states isn't enough.
So there's an immediate problem, which is hospital beds, oxygen, PPE, and other supplies. And then there's the problem looking forward of how you're going to shut this down, how are you going to turn it around, how are you going to break the chain of transmission. Vaccines is one of them, but there are other ways too, like shutting down the government. I have advised them in the past that you really need to do that. You've got to shut down. I believe several of the Indian states have already done that, but you need to break the chain of transmission. And one of the ways to do that is to shut down.
Any national shutdown will have come too late for some neighbouring countries like Nepal, where its healthcare system is also under major pressure. Non-government organisations based in Australia, India and Nepal are today holding an emergency briefing to highlight the scale of the crisis there. The World Health Organization has today launched a fundraising appeal to buy oxygen and medical equipment in India and is again pressing the need to get all countries vaccinated.
It is about 12 minutes to 6. I'm Lisa Owen and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Hey, Muriaki in Pitspita Kōrero after the news at 6, the latest from Dunedin, where a man has appeared in court in relation to the Countdown stabbings. There have been more violent confrontations between Palestinians and Israeli security forces in Jerusalem. The US, the European Union and the UK have urged Israel and the Palestinians to lower tensions as soon as possible. The violence escalated last night after Palestinians fired rockets toward Jerusalem. Israel retaliated with airstrikes against targets in the Gaza Strip. The ABC's Tom Joyner reports from Jerusalem.
Within one of Islam's holiest sites, explosions ring from outside the walls as a cloud of smoke fills the high ceilings of the historic Al-Aqsa Mosque. Outside, Israeli security forces fired rubber bullets and launched canisters of tear gas and stun grenades at Palestinians, who threw stones and other objects in return. Monday saw yet another day of violent confrontations in Jerusalem's Old City, Israeli police injuring more than 305 Palestinians, with 228 requiring hospitalisation, according to the Palestinian Red Crescent Society, which provides ambulance services in East Jerusalem. Violent clashes have culminated in the last several days, after beginning weeks ago in the form of protests against planned evictions by Jewish settlers of Palestinian families in the neighbourhood of Sheikh Jarrah. The evictions have sparked anger among Palestinians across East Jerusalem, as well as in the West Bank and Gaza. Recent days of escalations have pushed several countries, including Egypt, Jordan, Turkey and the United Arab Emirates, to condemn Israel's use of violence against Palestinians. But Israel has dug in. The country's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, saying Israel was fighting against forces of intolerance that want to take away Israeli rights.
We are determined to ensure the rights of all, which requires from time to time to stand strong, as Israeli police and our security forces are doing now. We support them in this just struggle.
By late afternoon in the Palestinian territory of Gaza, the governing Islamist militant group Hamas issued an ultimatum to Israel: evacuate the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Sheikh Jarrah neighbourhood or face the consequences. A short time later, they delivered on their threat. A volley of rockets fired from Gaza over Israel, some landing near Jerusalem without reported casualties. Israel responded with strikes of its own, killing 20, including 9 children in the Gaza Strip, according to the local health ministry. As night falls on Jerusalem, there's no visible end for the unrest, as the atmosphere in the city remains tense.
Tom Joyner reporting. Educators have taken their frustration and disappointment all the way to the top today, meeting with the government over pay worries. Some workers are furious about the directive. That means those in the public sector earning more than $60,000 will only get a pay rise in exceptional circumstances for the next 3 years, and there's nothing for anyone in the 100k plus bracket. The government's denied it's a freeze and says it's about equity and raising the wages of workers making 50k or less. And that's 25% of public servants. The NZEI sat down with the Minister in charge, Chris Hipkins, today, and the union's National Secretary, Paul Golter, joins me now. Kia ora, Paul. Everybody says that these talks were constructive, so what exactly does that mean?
Well, it's like any negotiation. It's slow forward movement. What we did, I think we got better clarification around the role of cost of living increases. it was a good chance for the unions to carry the message directly to the Minister about just how upset and angry our members are about this unilateral move. And it was also a good chance to put some cards on the table around what we think just has to be part of what workers in the public sector need in the next 3 years.
So, Paul, did you get any concessions or any back down on anything?
Well, if we put it this way, there were some areas where we think we made some direct movements, forward movements on. One was the review after 1 year. Previously, this was locked down for 3 years.
So just pause for a second, Paul, because that's important. So this deal of basically, well, the government doesn't like us using these words, but pay freeze, effective pay freeze, it's supposed to be in place for 3 years. So the concession you have got is what? That they will review that position?
After 1 year, yeah. So they understood the argument that 3 years was too long, and so where it landed was a review after 1 year. And that, I think, would probably be more akin to what workers could think about. But like all these things, it's a review, and that's the commitment.
So do you still believe it's a pay freeze?
Well, did we walk away with an absolute commitment to pay X, Y or Z? No, we didn't, but we didn't expect that because that's not the way negotiations are done at this level. We did get commitments to ensure that workload was a priority, and right across the public service, that in particular in teaching, that's a major issue, and the government have accepted that has to be a priority in negotiations and lies outside the bargaining, the turn throwing around pay. And the other point is the cost of living increases, because lots of workers over that 60,000K level were saying we need at least cost of living movements, and there was no indication originally from the government about that. And now there's a commitment to negotiate around cost of living increases in those negotiations for collective agreements. But the government is still pointing to higher increases for lower paid workers.
So, Paul, I put it to you again. Are there some workers within this regime who will effectively be on a pay freeze?
I can believe that would probably end up being the case, because, like all these things, Lisa, it is until you get to the negotiating table and you see the whites of the other side's eyes that you can actually answer that question positively.
So how confident are you about good faith bargaining? Because the government's been very clear about why it's doing this. Inequity, it says, but also it's clear that it's to save money. So that's a predetermined outcome, isn't it? Spend less than what you've previously done?
Yeah, yes, it is. And that's what really annoyed people, because on the one hand, they said nothing, said you're not getting anything, and then they said go into good faith negotiations to get nothing. Now, it sort of never made sense to us. There has been an indication that they will negotiate around cost of living increases, and really that's about as far as it could be pushed today.
So both the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister have said, well, people can still move within their stepped pay scale, right? So is that actually a pay increase? Because usually people have to take on extra duties, do extra work to move up the scale, don't they? And how often do people actually move?
We find those comments not particularly helpful, quite frankly.
In what way?
Well, because those relate to matters that were negotiated in the past, and we're looking to the future. Now, they are locked in agreements that were negotiated in good faith. So that relates to current, right now, and the past. What we're looking for.
So they're selling you something you already bought, Paul?
No, well, they're trying to sell the public that, not us.
Well, how do you think that the government has handled it?
I think it's been a dreadful exercise of miscommunication, poor messaging, and the timing of this is absolutely dreadful at the very time when public servants been at the front line of COVID, etc., and to have this drop them, and it's predictable, everyone would get up in arms.
Are you sure you just haven't misunderstood it, or it's hasn't been reported clearly what the deal is, which seems to be what some politicians are saying?
The deal, the original, what was put on the table originally, or where we got to today?
What was put on the table originally? The directive around pay?
No, I don't think any public sector workers believed that, what was being said to them by the government at the time. They were totally cynical about it, and that's why we were back around the table today.
Do you feel betrayed And do workers feel betrayed?
Workers certainly felt betrayed, and I can tell you that our call centre was plagued with phone calls from teachers and support staff, principals. Principals, for example, feel really disaffected by this because they had a lot of ground to make up from the last pay negotiations, and suddenly they were told originally you're going to get zipped.
So, Paul, is this over now, barring the individual collective negotiations? Do you think this is settled, or is this going to be a bone of contention between the unions and the government?
I think it'll be an ongoing bone of contention. I think we made forward steps today, and I'm pleased Chris Hipkins, as the Minister, fronted up around that. But this stuff will continue to niggle for sure.
And so are you expecting them to move more in your direction than they currently are?
We would like to think, but that you always go into negotiations with them like to think, really, and people remember the problem teachers had getting the pay increase that was needed last time. And in this case, without addressing this issue properly across the negotiation table, we're back where we started.
Thank you for your time this evening. That is Paul Galter, who is the NZEI's National Secretary. They met today with Chris Hipkins, who is the Minister in charge, obviously, of the state sector pay. Still not happy. Efforts to save a whale stranded in the River Thames in southwest London have failed for a second time. It's believed to be a young minke whale and was first spotted on Sunday. Rescuers towed it partway to safety, but it escaped and was later seen heading further upstream. The BBC's Tim Muffet reports.
A sad end to what has been an extraordinary day at Teddington Lock in southwest London. The minke whale that had become stranded in the River Thames was euthanised this evening. Animal welfare experts say it was the only way to avoid any more unnecessary suffering. The whale was first seen late yesterday afternoon. It had become stranded on a concrete ramp on Richmond Lock, around 2 miles along the river, and a 7-hour rescue operation began. During the night, the whale was towed away so that vets could try and carry out a health check, but it swam free from its harness. Today, crowds gathered in Teddington, along with the RSPCA and the RNLI, after it was spotted again. For a while, the whale captivated onlookers as it swam by the lock gates, but at around 2:30 this afternoon, it found itself unable to leave shallow waters by the riverbank. So the whale has become stranded yet again in the shallow waters here, and now all efforts are underway to try and set him free. Those efforts, unfortunately, weren't enough to free the whale. This evening, many are wondering how an animal typically found in the North Atlantic and Pacific Oceans could have swum so far up the River Thames.
Could have been ill, it could be sick. And that was Tim Muffet reporting there. Hey, a bit of your feedback before we get to the news at 6 on the subject of rugby and the investigation that's into a club game in Wellington. Allegations of racial slurs and some pretty bad behaviour as described. Lynn in Tauranga's got in touch to say, interesting that rugby football games are a stigma to our society when booze is allowed into our communities. It is the same old story and it's time to stamp it out, says Lynn. Another listener's got in touch to say, watched my first game of senior club rugby in Auckland in 2 years, a fortnight ago, and was surprised at the amount of drinking on the sideline. Interestingly, one of those drinking was a current Super Rugby Aotearoa player. Very interesting indeed.
RNZ News at 6. Ngā mihi nui ko Susana Leatawa aho. Bystanders who went to the aid of the people stabbed in a Dunedin supermarket are being described as heroes. 4 people are recovering in hospital after the attack in a Central City Countdown store yesterday. Southern District Commander Superintendent Paul Basham says 2 police officers were also at the supermarket at the time and stepped in to provide aid and support. He says along with Countdown staff and members of the public, they helped to de-escalate the situation and minimise any further harm. Mr Basham says they showed tremendous bravery.
I'm reluctant to be critical of anybody that actually did what they did yesterday to intervene. I think they all showed a tremendous degree of bravery and selfless sort of courage that I'm certainly not going to criticise them for. But as a general rule, if you can turn or walk away from something, then I think that's the best approach to take. But in this situation, I think they were heroes.
Paul Basham, a 42-year-old man, has appeared in court facing 4 charges of attempted murder. In a significant backdown, the government has softened its public sector pay freeze, agreeing that cost of living increases remain on the table. Senior ministers have been locked in crisis talks with unions today after a massive backlash at last week's directive. On Wednesday, the Public Service Minister, Chris Hipkins, announced that public servants earning more than $60,000 would only receive pay rises in special circumstances. But he now says cost of living increases can be discussed during negotiations.
The government remains committed to good faith bargaining, and in good faith bargaining, of course, there's room for compromise.
Chris Hipkins says the government has also agreed to review its guidance next year. The Auditor General is recommending the Ministry of Social Development get written confirmation for all businesses which received the wage subsidy to check they were eligible. Around $13.3 billion has been paid out through the wage subsidy scheme, and the Auditor General's office launched an inquiry last year into how it was being managed. A spokesperson for the office, Philip Press, says so far MSD has just been calling businesses to check they met the criteria to receive the money.
Asking them whether they are eligible for the scheme and whether they've complied with the obligations that go with receiving the money in the scheme. And the issue that we've raised is that those checks have been largely verbal. They haven't involved actual documents that provide proof.
Philip Press says while some steps were taken to make sure businesses were eligible for the wage subsidies, more work is needed on post-payment checks. Consumer New Zealand says people can check its website for reliable sunscreens after a US company was found to have provided false test results for products sold here. The owner of AMA Laboratories, Gabriel Letizia Jr., admitted defrauding customers and causing sunscreens to be marketed on the basis of false reports. Brands in New Zealand relying on AMA reports include Ecosol, Natural Instinct and Sukin. John Duffy says he urges affected manufacturers to retest their products. In Australia, a man is tested positive for coronavirus after being in the Victorian community for close to a week. He had recently returned from overseas and completed hotel quarantine in South Australia before returning a positive test today, the ABC's Dana Morse reports.
The man in his 30s travelled to his home in Wallet, 25 kilometres north of Melbourne CBD on the 4th of May after completing hotel quarantine in South Australia. He developed symptoms on the 8th and was tested yesterday, returning a positive result this morning. The Department of Health says he's isolating at home with his household contacts and they're urgently interviewing, isolating and testing any other close contacts. A list of exposure sites is yet to be released.
Dana Morse reporting. The Police Minister expects parliamentary scrutiny of proposed firearms prohibition orders will look at whether they will target Māori. Poto Williams today announced a crackdown on gangs and guns with high-risk individuals set to be banned from owning or being near a firearm. She was asked if she had received any advice about the impact on Māori of the policy, given that police admit to issues with systemic racism and unconscious bias.
The policy setting is to deal with the most serious offenders, and that is what the FPO that we are proposing is designed to do. What we will look at is having a very robust process going forward through the Select Committee, and those issues will be tested.
Poto Williams says the police are working to address unconscious bias and systemic racism. It's coming up to 5 minutes past 6. The Black Caps cricketer Tim Seifert is improving after contracting COVID-19 in India. The wicket-keeper batsman has been unable to return home from the abandoned IPL competition with other New Zealand-based cricketers. Black Caps coach Gary Stead has been exchanging messages with Seifert and says he's feeling more upbeat. All-white Chris Wood has played a leading hand in keeping Burnley in English football's Premier League and confirming Fulham's demise. Wood scored in Burnley's 2-0 win over Fulham, moving them up to 14th on the table, while Fulham, after just one season back in the Premier League, join West Bromwich Albion and Sheffield United in being relegated. Despite spending much of the season near the bottom of the table, Wood maintains he felt confident about Burnley's Premier League survival all along.
We've been here many times over the last few seasons. We've got a lot of experienced players in that dressing room, and we know if we apply ourselves in the right way, like we have done in the last 7 or 8 games, the wins will come and the points will come. So it was a fantastic application tonight from the lads, and we continue that going forward.
Leading Japanese tennis players Naomi Osaka and Kei Nishikori have expressed concern about staging the Tokyo Olympic Games as Japan battles to contain a surge in COVID-19 cases. Their comments come amid a decision by the head of the International Olympic Committee, Thomas Bach, to cancel a trip to Japan to review preparations for the Games because of the pandemic. That's the news.
Tonight on Nights, Tony Stamp samples the 10th anniversary reissue of Beast War's debut album. New Zealand writers read their letters to Catherine Mansfield. Well, she can't read them. And some largely libertarian thoughts from New Zealand Initiative economist Eric Crampton on COVID vaccines. Will waiving those rights to intellectual property, otherwise known as patents, speed up global vaccination, or are the bottlenecks elsewhere? All on Nights of me, Brian Crump, after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland to Waitomo, also Coromandel Peninsula, Bay of Plenty and Taupo. A few showers turning to rain for a time tonight and tomorrow with possible thunderstorms. Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, showers developing tonight, turning to rain tomorrow afternoon. Taranaki to Wellington, also Taumaranui, Taihape and Wairarapa, scattered rain, becoming widespread and possibly heavy tonight with a strong cold southeasterly change. Rain easing tomorrow morning but becoming widespread again tomorrow night. For Marlborough, Nelson and Bulla, periods of rain possibly thundery for Bulla tonight, easing overnight, clearing tomorrow evening. Canterbury, Otago and Southland, rain becoming widespread, snow lowering to 600 metres, clearing to fine weather tomorrow morning. Westland and Fiordland, rain, heavy, possibly thundery, clearing to fine weather overnight. Chatham Islands, low cloud and drizzle, turning to rain tomorrow morning. RNZ National, it's coming up to 8 minutes past 6.
Thanks, Susanna. No mai hoki mai. This is Checkpoint. Ko Lisa Owen tēnei. A central Dunedin countdown remains closed a day on from a knife attack that left 4 people in hospital. Police have today praised the supermarket staff, customers and emergency services for their swift action, saying it saved lives. This afternoon, a 42-year-old man appeared in court facing 4 charges of attempted murder. Louise Tanous joins me now from outside the countdown in central Dunedin. Kia ora, Louise. What happened at court this afternoon?
Yeah, Lisa, so the 42-year-old appeared in the Dunedin District Court at about 2:15 this afternoon. It was very brief. He was flanked down by 4 prison guards and wearing a prison gown, and he kept his head down and didn't talk throughout the entire proceedings. So he's been granted interim name suppression and been given a new court appearance in about a month's time on the 1st of June. So in the meantime, police say they'll be closely examining evidence at the scene here at Countdown in Dunedin, and they're also encouraging any witnesses who know any kind of information to come forward, and they're trying to get through any of those witnesses, as many as they can, before that new court date.
So what have Countdown said about how everyone is coping with this and what plans they have?
So a Countdown spokesperson that we've been talking to today has indicated that they've been doing counselling today. So around 60 people here in Countdown Dunedin turned up for those services, which is just a true representation of the close-knit community down here. So they've offered counselling to those staff involved and any kind of staff on the Countdown team. It's been a really big struggle for the whole team entirely. They've also indicated that tomorrow the store will be shut, and then again on Thursday that may be shut as well. They're going to make a decision about that tomorrow, which is Wednesday.
So you've been getting around the city there, Louise, today. What has it been like?
Yeah, Lisa, it's still a pretty dark day for people here in Dunedin. I've been wandering around key places like the Octagon, and the thing about Dunedin here is that everything is really close by. The supermarket, the police station, the court, all the businesses surrounding. The thing about it is that most people that I've spoken to know someone who was either shopping, who was working, or they know someone who knows someone. It's pretty clear to me that no one here in Dunedin is unaffected by what happened at the store here in Dunedin.
Thank you, Louise. That is our reporter Louise Tanous, who's joining us live from central Dunedin there outside the countdown where yesterday's stabbings took place. A so-called scout in the alleged murder of Ricky Wang helped clean up at the scene, bury a body in the central North Island and kept quiet about it for 2 years. Mr Wang went missing in 2017 and his body was found in a shallow grave near Tongariro last year. Yu Gao Zhang is to spend 19 months in prison on top of an existing sentence after acting on the demands of a drug ring. Our reporter Katie Todd was at the High Court in Auckland for the sentencing this morning. And just a warning, some listeners may find these details distressing.
The police might never have discovered Ricky Wang's bones buried near the desert road if it wasn't for a tip-off from one of 5 people involved in the alleged murder and its cover-up. Today, 24-year-old Yu Gaoshang was sentenced for his part. He was involved in the drug ring that allegedly had Mr Wang killed with a military-style dagger in 2017 because he owed money and had potentially stolen drugs. Justice Edwin Wiley says Yu was exploited by the head of the drug ring to help hide the body. He drove a pilot vehicle to the burial site one August night and kept watch for police officers, while others followed with Mr Wang's body.
You assisted in getting the freezer containing Mr Wang's body out of the van in which it had been transported, and then in getting Mr Wang's body out of the freezer and into a shallow grave. You assisted in covering the body in quickset concrete, and then in filling the grave with dirt using shovels that you and your co-offenders have brought with you for that purpose.
Back in Auckland, Justice Wiley said Yu had the job of bleaching the place where Mr Wang died, cleaning Mr Wang's apartment and removing methamphetamine-making equipment which was stored there. Crown lawyer Joanne Lee noted Yu could have reported the body to the police. Instead, she says he successfully concealed what had happened until he was arrested and confessed to one charge of being an accessory after the fact last month.
By the principles charged, he did this knowingly and moreover in circumstances that did involve particular callousness and indignity to Mr Wang's body and by extension, of course, to his family.
The lawyer acting for Yu, Gary Gottlieb, says his client's actions were driven by fear. He says he was so freaked out about the dead body that he was caught speeding by the police on the way back from the burial site.
He was so upset at what had happened, and that's why he then did some of his offending later, because he just knew he had to, because he knew they kill people. So he was in a situation for a young 20-year-old lost in this country.
Justice Wiley said there was a medium likelihood of Yu reoffending and noted it wasn't his first brush with the law. He's already in prison for 6 years on drug crimes. Justice Wiley told Yu he'd contributed to the devastating effects of Mr Wang's death. He said Mr Wang's father had a heart attack upon hearing of his son's death and had to stay in hospital for 2 weeks.
He is struggling to accept the fact that his son is dead and he's been unable to eat or sleep. He says that his and his wife's lives have become meaningless and he fears that they will die in loneliness and grief.
Yu will serve the 19-month jail sentence in addition to the prison term he is currently serving. He will be deported to China when he leaves prison. The 2 men accused of killing Mr Wang are due to stand trial later this year. For Checkpoint, call Katie Todd, Tēnei.
Hundreds of people marched to the Manawatu District Council buildings in Fielding today to protest against the council kicking the can down the road on Māori representation. The council voted last week to defer a decision on Māori wards until 2023. In 2017, the council voted to establish a Māori ward, but that was later overturned. Te Aorewa Rolliston has more.
Tangata whenua and members of the Manawatu community marched the streets, placards in hand, and haka and waiata among their calls. Last week, councillors voted 6-4 against establishing a Māori ward, deferring the matter until 2023. Meihana Jury from the Mana Whenua group Te Kōtui Reo Taumata Collective says historically the voices of Māori haven't been heard and the decision was catastrophic. He says holding the protest was a way to reaffirm their identity as Māori.
We have suffered a number of injustices over 200 years, yet we've been very, very committed as Māori in Manawatu to building bridges, both with Crown but also with the Manawatu District Council. We're concerned that at a time when other councils are voting for the establishment of Māori wards, Manawatu Council has taken a very different approach, which is really to reject the opportunity in front of us.
In a binding referendum, 7,000 members of the Manawatu community overturned the decision to establish a Māori ward. Mayor for Manawatu District Council, Helen Warboys, says she understands the Mamai members of the community are feeling and says she herself is not opposed to Māori wards. Despite some local Māori, including iwi and marae, no longer willing to consult until the wards are established, she says there is still room for agreement.
We've said that we will give our commitment to a Māori ward in the future, and we will work with iwi to take the community with us. And I just think that given 12 months, both iwi and our community will be in a much stronger position as partnership to go ahead with Māori ward.
Minister for Local Government, Nanaia Mahuta, says she stands by her decision to waive further public consultation when the bill, paving the way for new legislation for Māori wards, was fast-tracked.
Obviously, participation in decision-making is a key element of manifesting the aspirations of a treaty partnership. Many councils know they can do more. Ultimately, it's a decision for them with their local hapu and iwi.
Mehana Jury says he is concerned by the council's approach, but he is hopeful.
We want the opportunity to be able to work together in positive ways to do things that are going to be good for the community and good for our tamariki mokopuna.
The Mayor says the council will work with the local community, and she is hopeful that with more time for consultation, they can gain the support of the wider community heading to 2023. Mō te hōtaka o te ahiahi nei, ko te Aotearoa tēnei.
It is 17 minutes past 6 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. India's devastating second wave shows no sign of breaking as it spreads fast into rural areas. In the last 24 hours, the country's recorded more than 300,000 COVID cases and nearly 4,000 deaths. As CNN's Sam Kiley reports, it's hitting small communities hard.
It's the injustice of a disease that strikes at random that Govardhan finds hardest to bear. He insists that he hasn't cheated anyone in his life. At 70, no one will speak ill of him. A lifelong potter, every household knows him. I haven't a single bad habit like cigarettes or tobacco or anything. I'm 70. I've never had a row with anyone. So why is this happening to me, he pleads. For the local pharmacist, Jitu, it's too much. He's done what he can to help, but dozens have died here in the last month. And Govardhan has been ill for 3 weeks. This is Jitu's home. Most in this Gujarati village in India's west are farmers, enjoying fertile soil and plentiful livestock. When the wave of India's second pandemic engulfed India's teeming cities, people in the rural areas were not spared. With no village doctor or medics and a shortage of hospital beds in faraway cities, many here rely on Jitu's experience as a pharmacist. He sourced oxygen, prescribed drugs. There's no one here, no health centre, no doctor, no nurse. There are no facilities in this village. So then I tackled it in the way I saw fit. Does that make you angry? I got very angry, but what can one do? We've got no solutions, he says. Dinesh says he tried to get his father, Jivraj, into 4 hospitals, but they were full. His father was diagnosed as a severe COVID patient. Jivraj has seen the devastation of his village, yet his fear is no longer death. It's that COVID will destroy his family. His daughter has COVID, and his wife too. She's struggling to breathe on their veranda, under the eyes of Hindu deities. Their home is not far from the village crematorium, which is where volunteer efforts shift from Jitu to Giagashanga. Until today, he's been cremating people almost constantly. Now he clears up their remains. He's brought extra wood for what he fears is coming. In the village, there are homes which have lost up to 3 people, uncle, son, mother. He's kept careful records. So just in the last month, he tells me that, and this is the list of them, he's burned 90 people. In an average year, he burns 30 over 12 months. 90 in one. Vessels are ready for families to carry the ashes of their dead. Urns made by Govardhan the potter before he fell ill to a disease which has taken so many of his neighbours.
Sam Kiley reporting there. US authorities are investigating whether Russia was involved in a cyber attack which has disabled America's biggest fuel pipeline. The ABC's Barbara Miller reports.
It's been a frantic few days for US cybersecurity experts and Colonial Pipeline, which operates a 9,000-kilometre long pipeline supplying gasoline, diesel and jet fuel to the East Coast.
This is an all-hands-on-deck effort.
Eric Goldstein from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency.
There is now a whole-of-government effort ongoing to work with Colonial Pipeline to understand the intrusion, help them mitigate this incident, and get the pipeline back online as soon as possible.
Colonial Pipeline says it proactively took the pipeline, which stretches from Texas to New Jersey, offline after it learned of the weekend cyber attack. The FBI says its investigations have found ransomware developed by the group DarkSide was used in the attack. A statement on the DarkSide website says, about the latest news, our goal is to make money and not creating problems for society. The ransomware has previously been linked to Russia, and President Joe Biden had this to say when asked if the Kremlin could be behind the attack.
So far, there is no evidence based on from our intelligence people that Russia is involved, although there is evidence that the actors' ransomware is in Russia. They have some responsibility to deal with this.
President Biden has indicated he'll discuss the issue with President Vladimir Putin at an expected meeting next month. But the attack has exposed the particular vulnerabilities of the US to hackers. Homeland Security Advisor Dr. Elizabeth Sherwood Randall.
This weekend's events put the spotlight on the fact that our nation's critical infrastructure is largely owned and operated by private sector companies. When those companies are attacked, they serve as the first line of defense, and we depend on the effectiveness of their defenses.
And that was Barbara Miller reporting. A Dunedin family's pulling out all stops to find their two much-loved missing dogs. And by all stops, we mean all of them. Search and rescues combed the area near their Brighton home more than once. The family's put up a spotter plane and a drone, but still no sign of Scruff and Floss, two border terriers, who are parents to a new litter of 6 little pups. Rowan Newman says her 3 children and their mates were playing down the back of the property last Friday, where Floss and Scruff were last seen at about 2:30.
My 3 children had 2 of their friends over, and they just popped down into our gully, which is about 200 metres away from the house, to play Nerf for, and the dogs went down with them. And that was the first time that Floss, the mother of the babies, had left her babies, She would go out to the toilet and then go back into the room. So this was the first time she had a wee adventure out. And then after the kids all came up at different times, none of them had the dogs. I just assumed they'd chased a rabbit and ended up the gully over Big Stone Road, and then there's a forestry block in there.
But what, you went for a wander to see if you could find them, but no sign?
Yeah, so we've had, first thing I did was I jumped on the motorbike and went out, because they love chasing motorbikes. So I went out on the motorbike so they could hear hoping that they'd hear the bike and come home. And then I just, shut up the road. But then I kept searching up till about 9:30, 10 that night, just calling motorbike. I'd stop the bike and I'd call and then keep going, yeah. And then the next day I had about 20 people in the forestry helping me look, all local. And, and then the search has just gone on from there.
So tell us about that search, because it's been pretty epic, hasn't it?
Yeah, it has. It's been a very traumatic time for me and the kids. So I've had Land Search and Rescue have come out. They've been amazing. They've gone into the forestry with their dogs. I think there was about 10 of them. They've been out there 4 times. And then people at night have also, from Search and Rescue, have come and just walked up and down, walked through the forestry calling, getting their dogs to bark on command. Because my dogs would, they've got great recall, so they would come. I had no worries about them not coming when I call, because their recall is so good. So I would call and I was always just listening, hoping for a bark back, So I've had search and rescue. I've had drones out, just scoping the landscape where the forestries aren't. And then we also got a plane on Sunday, and my son, my partner went up in the plane on Sunday.
That is a lot. That is a lot looking for 2 dogs. So tell us what these 2 mean to you.
They're just sort of like our family, you know, like they're my children's dogs, and I work from home, and they're just 24/7 with me, and then they sleep with the kids. And my son, who's 11, it's sort of like Scruff is his rock, his, you know, security blanket as such. He'd sleep with Quinny every night, you know, Scruff, and they just had the most beautifulest bond, you know, and Quinn would wear a shepherd's whistle, and he'd just blow the whistle, and Scruff would come. So he had him really well trained, put a lot of energy and time, and just when Quinn would get home from school, he would go straight to Scruff. Like, they were just two wee soulmates together, and I just feel so brokenhearted for my children. And they just keep saying, "You'll find them, Mum, you'll find them." And I just want closure, you know, I just want something to be able to, you know, to help, basically, yeah. They mean the world to us. It's so hard to describe, to be honest, how much they mean. I feel like I'm constantly in a panic state, like I'm just in a panic, like I need to find them, you know. That's what's driving me, because I'm finding,
They have a way of working their way into your hearts, our pets do. Can you think of a reason why anyone would want to take these dogs?
The only thing I can think of is the fact that, like, she's got puppies and we've got puppies here. So the only thing I could possibly think was money. If someone's taken them to breed them, to constantly, you know, to continuously breeding them. That's my thing.
So tell us the litter then. How many puppies have you got?
So we've got 6 puppies, yeah.
And what's this meant for them?
Oh, it's awful, because they howl and they make their little sounds, and, you know, they're just sort of frantic, like, they want their mum. It's been awful, to be honest. My daughter, who's 6, she's been really helping out and feeding them every 3 hours, and I've had to wake up during the night every 3 hours to feed them, you know. But they miss their mum, they know she's gone, and I've just kept them together, and I've kept Floss's blanket in there with them, and yeah. But like I said, one of them howls, one in particular howls, and I just feel like he's howling for her, you know.
And that's Rowan Newman. Now, the family is offering a $1,000 reward for the return of the 2 dogs, so we'd love to hear from you if you know where Floss and Scruff are. NASA says a mission which was sent to take samples from an asteroid 5 years ago is now making its way back to Earth. The rock and dirt could give us new information about the formation of the solar system. The ABC's Rachel Mealy has this report.
All stations, the ADM burn has completed. We have a nominal ADM burn, and we're bringing the samples home.
It's the first time NASA has sent a spacecraft to orbit a near-Earth object and bring a sample back to Earth. Sandy Friend is the mission's operations manager.
The prime goal of this mission is to bring that sample home. So we set out, we did what we were supposed to do at Bennu. We've got those samples in hand, and it's time to bring them back. So I'm really excited for this next phase, and to see what the scientists learn once they have these samples in hand here back on Earth.
Professor Dante Loretta is the project's principal investigator.
At moments like these, I always think about the spacecraft and just imagine it 200 million miles or more away from us, doing everything that we're asking it to do. And today we're asking it to fire those engines. It's now moving away over 600 miles an hour from Bennu on this way home.
The small unmanned spacecraft fired thrusters to remove itself from the orbit of the asteroid Bennu and put itself into an orbit to bring it back to Earth. But the journey home will take a bit more than 2 years. Ben Pope is an astrophysicist from the University of Queensland. He says the OSIRIS-REx will jettison its cargo in September of 2023.
It's going to be one of these things where it swings briefly past the Earth and then just shoots right on by to further explorations of the solar system, leaving behind a capsule which is going to drop into the Earth's atmosphere. A parachute will deploy, and it'll land this capsule in the Utah desert. Now, this is a very involved process. It's going to have to be picked up by ground crews and transferred to NASA facilities in Texas for analysis.
He says the analysis of that sample will help us understand more about the origins of the solar system.
We've got time for this evening. Thanks for joining us. Have a wonderful night, and we'll catch you again tomorrow.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. Police say bystanders who went to the aid of the people stabbed in a Dunedin supermarket were heroes. 4 people are recovering in hospital. Unions are claiming progress in the dispute over the government's pay freeze after crisis talks at the Beehive today. Victoria has reported its first community COVID-19 case in more than 2 months. Authorities are searching for the source. A man in China was left dangling from a 100-metre high bridge when the glass floor was blown away in high winds. Staff managed to rescue him. Our next news and weather is at 7.
Take the pulse of the day's news every weeknight at 10.
I know that